Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday, the 28th of June. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, the format of our programme is a little bit different. I'll have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 125 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I'll give you a very quick run through today's headlines. Then I'll introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will look at the main story that's broken in Scotland today, and we'll discuss that at length and cover as much of it as we can. At least 21 people are still missing after a Russian missile hit a crowded shopping centre in the central Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk on Monday. About 18 people are believed to have been killed. Military personnel, volunteers, firefighters and police have been working non-stop to recover bodies from the rubble. Authorities estimate that there were between 200 and 1,000 people inside the mall that afternoon. The leaders of the G7 said Russian President Vladimir Putin's attacks aimed at civilians were a war crime and condemned the abominable attack in Kremenchuk. We stand united with Ukraine in mourning the innocent victims of this brutal attack. Russian shelling of a residential area in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, killed at least 5 civilians on Monday, the regional governor said. A further 19 people were wounded in the attack, Ole Sinihubov said. A Russian missile attack also killed at least 8 civilians and wounded 21 in Ukraine's eastern Lysychansk region. Today, when the civilian people were collecting water from a water tank, the Russians aimed at the crowd, Sergei Haidai, the Luhansk governor, said on Telegram. Russian forces are being increasingly hollowed out, have degraded combat effectiveness, and only achieved tactical success at Severodonetsk, despite fielding the core elements of 6 different armies, according to the latest UK Ministry of Defence intelligence briefing. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that there can be no return to pre-war ties with Russia. Scholz said that with its attack on Ukraine, Russia has broken all the rules, all the agreements we have made with each other on countries' cooperation after the G7 summit. The UN Security Council will meet on Tuesday to discuss Russia's targeted attacks on civilians at the request of Ukraine. NATO will boost the number of troops on high alert by more than 7-fold to 300,000 personnel in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the military alliance's forces in the Baltic states and 5 other frontline countries would be increased up to brigade levels, that means doubled or trebled, to between 3,000 and 5,000 troops. Any encroachment on the Crimean Peninsula by a NATO member state could amount to a declaration of war on Russia, which could lead to World War III, Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, was quoted as saying yesterday. And the US is planning to buy and send more medium to long-range missile systems to Ukraine, including NASAMS, an advanced surface-to-air missile system, according to defence officials. And now we have a brief look at today's headlines. Downing Street is expected to ditch its manifesto commitment to increase the defence budget by at least 0.5% above inflation every year. The 2019 Conservative manifesto pledged to keep defence spending above the 2% of GDP and increase the budget by at least 0.5% above inflation every year. But with inflation above 9% and expected to continue to rise further, a senior government source warned the pledge was unlikely to be met. Conservative MPs are privately warning that a swathe of cabinet ministers and other high-profile Tories are on course to lose their seats at the next general election under Boris Johnson. Those with seats at risk in the south of England include the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, the Cabinet Minister Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt. MPs in London whose seats are also at risk include Ian Duncan-Smith and Theresa Villiers. Johnson himself could be on course to lose to Labour in Uxbridge. Figures released today by the Department for International Trade show encouraging signs of inward investment in Scotland. The latest figures show a substantial increase in both the number of projects and the number of jobs created in 2021-22, compared to the previous financial year. Scottish Greens have welcomed provisions in the Coronavirus Recovery and Reform Bill, which will strengthen tenants' rights and make it harder for landlords to evict them. The deaths of 50 people crossing into the US from countries south of the border on Monday prompted an outpouring of compassion from some, while others seized on the chance to criticise American immigration policies. San Antonio's mayor, Ron Nirenberg, called the discovery a horrific human tragedy, while the Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott instead attempted to blame the deaths on President Biden's immigration policies. Fears over police violence and attacks by anti-abortion activists targeting women's rights campaigners have been growing following the US Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe against Wade. There has been a wave of incidents at demonstrations across the US where overwhelmingly peaceful protesters have been subject to police violence and attacks by pro-life activists, including an incident of a car driving dangerously through marchers. The Public Health Minister in Scotland, Marie Todd, has announced that a review of Scottish Government's minimum unit pricing for alcohol is now underway. A total of 511 residential rehabilitation placements were approved between the 1st of April 2021 and the 31st of March 2022, according to latest statistics from Public Health Scotland. This is the first year in which PHS has collected this information. However, the number of placements in the first 3 years of this year were up by 20 on the previous quarter at 133. A total of 95% of medical trainee posts for 2023 have been filled, the highest percentage at this stage in the recruitment process in the last 5 years. Of the 1,018 posts already advertised for next year's intake, 964 trainees have been placed across all specialities. The figure includes all of Scotland's 268 GP trainee posts advertised so far in 2023. Speciality areas of clinical radiology and core psychiatry are also fully subscribed. The number of people successfully applying for a Young Carer grant has risen in the last year. A total of 2,490 applications were approved in 2021-22, up 200 from the previous year. This means that its introduction in October 2019 until 30th of April this year, more than £1.8 million has been paid out to 4,265 young people, with some getting the payment up to 3 times. The Young Carer grant, which is unique to Scotland, was increased from £308.15 to £326.65 from the 1st of April this year. And NHS dental examinations are expected to have doubled between April and June compared with the first 3 months of 2022, with about 700,000 examinations taking place as practices continue to recover from the pandemic. The sharp increase in appointments follows the relaxation of some infection prevention and control measures brought in to protect patients and staff at the height of the pandemic. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Councillor Dr. Siobhan Tolland. Siobhan is an SNP councillor for Lochee and Dundee and is also a community and political activist and is a founding member of the community group in Dundee, Dundee Together. Siobhan, how are you keeping this evening?
Not too bad, thanks. In fine fettle, given the announcement today.
Well, it's fantastic to see you this evening, Siobhan, and thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. Now, you're teeing up the announcement from this afternoon, so I'll do a very brief introduction, and then you and I will discuss what's been going on in Holyrood. Because Scotland will vote in an independence referendum on the 19th of October 2023, the First Minister has announced, as she also unveiled preparations for a legal battle with Westminster. Mapping out Scotland's route to IndyRef 2, Nicola Sturgeon told MSPs that the Scottish Government will ask the same question as in 2014. Speaking in Holyrood, Ms Sturgeon announced the Scottish Government has published a referendum bill today. The Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain QC has referred the bill to the Supreme Court, Ms Sturgeon added, gearing up the Scottish Government for a legal challenge to Westminster. The First Minister also wrote to the Prime Minister to outline the content of her major update to our Parliament and also to say that she was still open to negotiating a Section 30 order. The question of competence should now be discussed and decided in court rather than in Parliament, she added. She said lawfulness must be established as a matter of fact, not just opinion. Should the Supreme Court reject the bill and the Prime Minister again block a Section 30 order, then Ms Sturgeon pledged to fight the next general election on the single issue of independence, saying that this would make the vote a de facto referendum. So today we have had a date for a referendum, a route map, a bill, and a preemptive reference to the Supreme Court. So Siobhan, there's quite a lot to digest in the news from Holyrood this afternoon.
It definitely was. I think that it's a master stroke, I think, to preempt the Supreme Court and to kind of take that forward. Just basically grab the bull by the horns and take that forward, I think. And I think it reflects the difference in what's happening now than what did in 2014. I think in 2014, and this is how I kind of felt that we were never really going to win, is that in 2014 we allowed the UK and the Unionist and Better Together campaign to basically define the debate and define the terms of that debate, whereas this has started, the gun, the firing has now started, but this has basically preempted that and basically took that forward as a kind of non-defensive strike. It's basically taken that and defined the terms by ourselves. And I think that will set the tone, I think, for the rest of this campaign, is that Scotland sets the terms of the debate, we set the terms about what we need, and we set the terms about how we move forward. That's how it should be. That's how an independent Scotland should be. But I think in doing that and taking that and saying, right, let's kind of, let's allow the Lord Advocate to put that forward and take, and put that into the kind of UK, or basically challenge the UK in terms of its competence through the Supreme Court. We take control of that and we take charge. And she was very clear on that. She talked quite a bit about had we not done that, then we could have potentially been mired in legal battles for a long time, which would just obviously delay the process. It's part of that. You know how sometimes in kind of legal terms you can just, if you're kind of suing somebody or something, then companies can literally just drag it on until you've no energy left. I think that she was trying to avoid that, but take control of the debate, take control of the terms of the process and the terms of the debate. So I think that was a very good move. Legality and democracy, that was the two issues she spoke very, very closely on.
Absolutely, Siobhan, and we're going to unpick all of those points that you've so helpfully started off making as we go through the programme this evening. You were lucky enough to be elected. You were successfully elected as a local councillor for the SNP in Lochee in Dundee earlier this year. So I know you won't have had much time to assess reaction to today's news in your own ward. However, how do you think that voters in Yes City Dundee are going to respond to today's statement by the First Minister?
I mean, we're Yes City, so I think that there's going to be a lot of excitement. I think that Dundee has a history of pushing forward and thinking outside the box when it comes to politics, and I think there's an element of that. That's why I think we were Yes City in 2014. It's not those that are looking forward to independence that I'm more concerned about at this stage, though. It's those that are unsure or a little bit scared, I think, for me, because it's not. It's easy to galvanise people that have been waiting for this for years, and there's a lot of people in Dundee to the core have been waiting for this, but there's still a lot of people that are scared. They're scared of change. The Brexit debate has galvanised independence, but there's an element of it's shown how difficult change can sometimes be. COVID is another factor, I think, where people are left actually a bit war weary and probably traumatized as well to a large degree. So it's managing that and allowing a safe space for those that are unsure of the path of moving forward and actually a little bit scared. I was just thinking that in terms of my role as a counsellor, that's where I could kind of play a role. It's not always about pushing the debate forward as such, but allowing space for people to think through issues, talk through issues, understand the pros and cons of this situation. This is a massive decision. Yes, we're independent supporters, of course we are. I'm in the SNP. This is why I joined the party, to get independence, but at the same time we have to understand the difficulties and fears that those that aren't convinced of that yet. That's a difficult path for people to navigate. And for me, in one of the roles I've kind of felt I've played as a community activist is precisely that, is to help people navigate that difficulty ahead. Having said that, I was just speaking to one of my constituents the other day, who was talking about he wasn't quite sure now was the time for independence. And one of the issues I kind of raised with them was, if we look back since 2014, we look back at the crises that's happened within the UK, we look back at the dramas that's happened within the UK, it's pretty much been Scotland being dragged into those dramas and crises. They've not really been of our making. Even COVID to a certain degree, which was a non-political, just dropped a bomb onto the nation and the world, as it were. Even how that was managed, especially in the early days, it kind of sucked us into a worse crisis than what we could have had we been independent. We might have gone down a more kind of New Zealand route. But there is that element there that we need control over our choices, we need control over our fate, and that's not what we've had since 2014. If anything, and that's another thing that Nicola Sturgeon picked up on quite a lot, isn't it? What was it? She says Westminster will always block. They will always have the final say. So no matter what drama we get dragged in, and no matter what crises we get dragged into, and there's going to be more. We're in the middle of an energy crisis, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. It's Westminster made, and we're being dragged into that. And I think ultimately, I'm very, very positive in terms of how we will move forward. I think the people of Scotland have rejected Westminster, said that back in the 2019 general election. The next stage now is just to navigate the path forward, and I think that path will be a majority thinking independence is the best way. I haven't spoken to many constituents, because literally just that today, but it's certainly something that on a local level we have to take seriously and respectfully, I think.
Completely, Siobhan. In terms of Westminster blocking, as we're always reminded, power devolved from Westminster is power retained by Westminster, and that is what we're looking to change here. Now, you and I are obviously on the same page this evening, because I was about to ask you, how should, and in particular, having listened to some of the responses from opposition politicians in Holyrood this afternoon, how do you think should pro-independence people at the moment, for example, those living in Dundee, respond to the only line that unionist politicians in Scotland seem to have at the moment, which is, now is not the time, a typical deflection?
Well, respond by saying that's nice, but the democratic will of the people has said differently. We have a mandate, and I think that the SNP have been very strong on this in recent weeks and months. We have a cast iron mandate, which is the term that's often used. We've had mandate after mandate. If you believe in democracy, then you have to take that mandate seriously. The issue, I think the issue that the unionist argument has is that it's disparate, that it's in crisis in and of itself because the union is in crisis. You just look at Northern Ireland as well, and what's just happened there recently too, the the kind of the potential of a border poll happening, that the union is absolutely in deep crisis. It's the end of empire, I suppose, if you're looking at it like that. But that kind of level of now is not the time. Well, now will never be the time. I think that from if you were a unionist and a relatively reasonable unionist, I think that you would be trying desperately to find better arguments. I think that the discussions and the arguments that came from the opposition today, I think only fuels the independence debate for me, or the independence argument. They're old arguments, they're stale arguments, they're non-democratic arguments. You can say now is not the time as much as you want. You can say, I don't want a referendum, but democracy dictates differently. The democratic process is that we won the majority in the Scottish Parliament, the SNP and the Greens. We won that majority, and we won on a huge majority elect in terms of seats as well. If you only have a minority of the seats, you don't get to dictate the terms of the democratic process. You can add to it, you can create a positive contribution to it, but you don't get to dictate the terms. So I do think there's an element here that the longer that argument moves, the more it will backfire on them. I think the reason, or well, one of the reasons that the kind of the legal argument has just moved in is it depoliticizes that process, actually. And Nicola Sturgeon talked about, quite a bit about that today, I think, that she talked about just taking that process out, that the legality of it will be not opinion, but legal fact. Then it allows the politicians and the Yes movement and the Better Together movement and whatever how that manifests itself to talk about the issues, because we can't keep going back and forth. We have a mandate and then the opposition saying, no, you don't. We do, and let's find out how that works out in the Supreme Court of Law. And then what happens, we'll take that from there. But yeah, I think the argument is, it's one-dimensional, considering where we are at the moment in time.
Completely. Thank you, Siobhan. Now, thinking about the independence movement just for a moment, we're going to look at this news item from today in a number of different ways, but thinking about the independence movement for a moment, and apologies if I'm stretching this metaphor too far, but do you think, are folks being asked, well, you know me too well, are folks being asked to board a shiny new independence bus? Or is it one that's just been washed and cleaned and fueled? Or is it a bus that's been rusting away in the back of a garage for a while and is going to have to be jump-started? Or does any of that matter in terms of the bus? Because now we've got a route map.
Yeah, I mean, so trying to get my head around your metaphor. I think that, I mean, I'm a historian to trade, as you know, and I kind of thinking about this with my historian's hat on, I suppose, is that the bus has evolved over probably about a century, isn't it, since the kind of probably the 1920s, when that kind of that literary movement began to consider a culture outside the UK structures, a Scottish culture outside the UK. And we've evolved and developed culturally, socially, and then eventually politically as well. The last kind of phase, probably the economics of it. But yeah, I think that for the independence movement, I think I'm hoping that it will kind of galvanise. I think there's always going to be, I think, the negativity that sits on the fringes. But what we do need is a positive case. We do need to kind of start building that case together and showing a unity, I suppose, and actually a respect. That we move forward. I would like the bus to be nice and shiny, but I would also like it to be realistic shiny, if that makes sense.
I promise not to mention buses again this evening. We'll not go there. That's a promise. So, in terms of some points that you were making in terms of the campaign, I think what I saw from Holyrood today was a typically strong and confident performance from the First Minister this afternoon, up to the point where she was saying to the unionists, come on, call my bluff, with a smile on her face. So in terms of her performance today, do you think that gives us, and to your point about positivity in the campaign. Do you think that gives us any indication about what this independence campaign will be like, and perhaps how it might be different to the campaign last time?
I think it's going to be hugely different from the campaign last time. I think ideologically and maybe perhaps philosophically, what we had in 2014 was an imagining of what could possibly be. And I think that I've always thought that we had to go through that process in 2014. I wasn't particularly convinced that we would win, but I felt that we had to go through that process of sparking the imagination in terms of what might be possible. I think the last 10 years since that, 2012, when it first kick-started, has been a development of that in terms of practical infrastructure political terms. So in terms of the campaign I think will be more focused. It'll probably be more serious. It'll be more solid. It will be more, some people might say this is a bad thing, but, and I don't mean it as, it will be more governmental in that it will be a nation in waiting and a government ready to, or a parliament ready to take that nation forward. I think the other kind of tone for this one will be that I think the understanding that we're going to win is probably going to be much stronger. I think there was a lot of hope in the last one, but I think that what we're doing is building the independence referendum. I think probably most importantly, it's taken a while to kind of think through my thoughts here, but probably most importantly is 2014 was an imagining, like I say, but this referendum, and especially for me, it's not about the referendum, it's about the country we're going to build. And actually that seamless transition into the independent country that we're becoming. This is us preparing to be independent rather than fighting or arguing or debating in a referendum. This is about planning and making sure that people are on board with those plans moving forward. That's probably the biggest difference for me, that there is a kind of coherent plan for independence rather than a conceptual thinking of what it might be to be independent.
Thank you, Siobhan. Now, there's a couple of wee things also about the independence campaign that I wanted to touch on. Whilst I appreciate the route map has only been delivered by the First Minister today, but there's a couple of things that immediately struck me, and I wanted to see what your thinking was about them. So, firstly, as this campaign properly gets underway, this time, how do you think we should be dealing with politicians who have nothing to do with Scotland, journalists who know nothing and have nothing to do with Scotland, and those who fund both those politicians and those journalists, and who also have absolutely nothing to do with Scotland? And now, I'm not singling her out, but Allegra Stratton's brief piece for Bloomberg this evening was shocking. So, what, in terms of the way in which independence campaigners and the way in which the campaign operates this time, do you think will we have to change the way in which the campaign is run in order to address these politicians and these journalists who have nothing to do with Scotland, or are we going to find ourselves mired or enmeshed in the way that perhaps the campaign found itself last time?
In terms of, I mean, I'm assuming you're meaning in terms of the kind of the media coverage and the kind of, I suppose, the anti-democratic nature of it.
Yes.
Again, I'm always a bit more pessimistic in terms of our relationship to the media, because what I do think is that we've been, as a movement, in existence for a decade now. We have had not many media friends. I mean, we have the National, and we probably have kind of a few individuals within the institutions, but institutionally, it's pretty fair to say that it's pretty much pro-union almost across the board. But yet here we are talking about how we're going to be independent, so really, to a certain extent, it's like, yes, it's not fair. Yes, of course it's not democratic, of course it's not. There's a wee bit of that's life, but I don't think that ultimately it will make any difference. I think that actually culturally, politically, people have made up their mind. I'm not sure that this kind of media barrage will have any difference on how people perceive what Scotland's going to be like. I think if you look at some of the campaigns that's taken place in the general elections and Scottish elections in terms of media campaigns and so forth, it's been pretty brutal, some of it. But yet here we are. We're winning a mandate. We win a majority time and time again. When it comes to the vote, the people of Scotland vote for Europe, and they vote for an alternative to Westminster, which is increasingly independent. So, in that respect, I'm always a bit more of an optimist in that respect. When we become independent, however, then we really do need to start thinking about how we democratise our media and how we kind of rule out those issues, as you say. I don't think we're going to get rid of that during the campaign. But it's something to think about when we move forward. The Norwegian model of kind of sponsoring all parties and all political hues in terms of to give them a voice in terms of media is a good place to start. We do have to democratise the media. And maybe that's the debate we have now, is how do we build a better media structure when we become independent. Let's think about that strategy.
Completely. I was prompted with that question, thinking a little bit about the impact that some say the vow on the front page of the Daily Record had
Yeah.
at the end of the 14.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that the impact of the media is overblown in some senses, and certainly amongst people who campaign for independence. They are
Yeah.
now long since anaesthetised to whatever it is that the BBC or the Scotsman or the Herald are saying, and they pay no attention.
Yeah.
So I think there is. I understand the point you're making. As a result of that, we'll just have to see if there is another stunt like the vow in the next campaign and see where we get to. But
I think the
we'll move on.
solidity. Oh, sorry. I was just going to. I think the solidity is a bit stronger now, though. I think if you look back of the last weeks of the referendum, there was about a week where we all thought, yeah, we're going to win, and everybody got dead excited. But actually, we were always the outsider. If you were to bet on us, we would always be the outsider. So we kind of shifted. There was about a week where we peaked in those polls, and then the vow came and it kind of almost like pulled us back again. I think this one's going to be much more solid. I think that the power of that will probably be less. The gimmicks, I think, will probably have less impact because there's more solid understanding and a more solid base this time.
That's a very good point. I rarely put money on at the bookies, but I better be the bookies tomorrow morning and see what the odds are at the moment.
Yeah, see what the odds are. Yeah, yeah. I mean, they know. Like, we should check that.
Completely. But you're making the point there, Siobhan, about it being a different sort of campaign in terms of having a much stronger foundation in a sense, and being, we're saying in a way, governmentally led, or having more about government about it. And so I was thinking of the first part of that foundation, which the First Minister and the Scottish Government laid a couple of weeks ago. The first part of the documentation that was being published, and which was and the First Minister referenced it again today. And that documentation was the comparison between Scotland and a number of comparable other countries in Northwest Europe. And so, do you think that the message about how relatively badly off we are as a result of remaining in the Union, do you think that that's going to get through to voters, or is it still too theoretical? As the First Minister said today, the worst cost of living crisis in the G7, the second lowest growth in the G20, a government that stokes industrial strife, demonises workers, and provokes a trade war with our nearest and biggest markets, and businesses and public services struggling for staff because freedom of movement was ended against our will. So do you think that economic comparison, which is objective, it's not subjective, is that going to cut through with voters, do you think?
I hope so. I think in terms of how we build those arguments, if we lose that argument, then we probably lose the referendum. I would say. I was doing the European movement in Scotland stall in Dundee on Saturday. I kind of arrived late, but I got about an hour or so done, and I got talking to a woman who was kind of quite curious actually, and she immediately started launching into the story about a friend of hers who is now turning the heating off, and she's trying to persuade her to just keep it on a little bit to save yourself from being, so cold, and but she can't afford it. So these I say this because it's stories like that you need to kind of cut through, that these are real consequences, and this is the consequence of Brexit, where actually it's a consequence of a Brexiteer in UK that were now in exist, that they were now kind of imprisoned in the words of Nicola Sturgeon. So it's how we kind of pitch that. I'm thinking about how, I do this as, I suppose, as a local councillor and community activist, and that is really, if we cannot show we can make a difference to people's lives on an ordinary everyday level, and show that they will be better off than in comparison to Westminster, then we probably don't deserve to be independent, because this is what we need. We need to, for me, this is the whole point. The point is about making sure that kids don't go hungry, making sure that the society we live in is more equal, making sure that our pensioners are not isolated and lonely, improving our mental well-being, improving our physical health, and all those issues that come with it. It's one of the things that the opposition tends to do is they tend to separate these two issues out. Why are you talking about a referendum when we actually have all these issues to do? This is where we need to work on. These issues and the referendum and an independent Scotland are absolutely intertwined. If we can successfully win that argument, and I think if we can successfully show that we can be, you know what, we don't want to be a massive global power. We don't want to be this kind of huge kind of structure that we just want safety, we want security, we want to know that our kids or our grannies or our uncles are going to be okay. And I think that that's much more important in a post-COVID society as well. People are looking for a safety net now, and we need to show that that can happen, and that independence is the only path that can allow that now. I'm absolutely convinced that that is the only way. But that's what we need to do. We need to show that this will make a difference to people's lives. I know I make reference to the post-45 a lot, but it really is, it's on that level, but much, much more, I think. People came out of the Second World War and the 30s and the war that came before that, very war-weary, exhausted, traumatised, and what they needed was to know that they were going to be okay as a society. And I think that historically the parallels are there as well. That's what we need to do, is show people that there is safety in the independence that we're going to bring. And if we can be, because what we've got that, and if to go back to the Westminster, what we have is complete chaos, complete uncertainty with the Westminster government. We don't know how big our fuel rise is going to be. You know, the amount of another £1,000, £1,000 it might be in October. That's after another 1,000 just back there a few months ago. So that kind of spiraling uncertainty, what we need to show is how we manage that, how Scotland would have managed that had we been independent. So it's those kind of economic arguments that we need to win.
Yes, thanks, Siobhan. You make some very good points. Thinking of our older voters who were an important part of the demographic at the last referendum. I wondered, and this is a hypothetical question, but the point you're making with regard to the re-establishment of a social contract in the way that there was in 1945, that might very well be a positive message to them, or to some of them, in terms of what an independent Scotland can do. But let's move on, because time's against us. I was going to start with you looking a little bit at the legal aspect of what we heard from the First Minister today, but I'll come into the legal aspect from a different, as you'd expect with me, we'll come into it from a different direction. Now, I was wondering, as I do, whether there is going to be another difference in this campaign in comparison to 2014. And the difference I was thinking about is that we now have a First Minister who's a woman, The Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bean, QC, is a woman. The Solicitor General, Ruth Charters, is a woman. And I'm not forgetting Joanna Cherry, QC, either in this. Of course, in
Mhm.
2014, it was Alex Salmond, and the Lord Advocate at that time was the Labour appointee, Frank Mulholland. So I'm wondering, in terms of the campaign, is the dynamic different when the campaign this time, at least at this stage, is being planned, directed, and led by a group of extremely talented women?
Yes, isn't that interesting? I always thought it'd be the women that would win it for us. I remember saying that to Maggie Chapman. I think it was just after, I think it must have been 2015. It's like, it's the women that's going to win it. She's like, yeah. But it is, it's interesting. And I think that it shows a kind of a breath of fresh air for me, I think, in modern politics. Women, it, it's an interesting one because what you've got, I think I've talked about this before, but what you've got are pockets and smaller nations across the country, across the globe rather, that are led by women. And I'm not necessarily convinced it's because it's women as such, but I think what's happened after so many centuries, decades of kind of, male power, as you will, women come with a fresher perspective. And I think that, I mean, if you look at the Nicola Sturgeon effect, if you want to kind of talk about it like that, that it has kind of brought women over to the independence referendum. I think membership of female membership in my local branch kind of grew quite a lot, for the 2021 Scottish elections. So there is an element there that I think that it presents a very different way of looking at the world and looking at Scotland at this moment in time. Testimony to organisations like Women for Independence, I think as well, that did a lot of groundwork in the 2012-2014 referendum. But I think with female leadership at this moment in time just comes a fresher thinking as well, less maybe dogmatic, less stuck in the bureaucracy of government, perhaps. I think that's where it comes from, because when you're out of power for so long, you kind of come in with kind of ordinary thinking in an extraordinary way, if that makes sense.
Mhm, absolutely. Just thinking about that dynamic again for a moment.
Yeah.
With we have a prime minister who I think it's difficult to think of a more misogynist prime minister than the current one. How do you think he and his advisors he and his advisors, how are they going to cope with a campaign that's being planned, directed, and led by a group of very talented women?
Well, they ain't going to like it. But there's a kind of a strange. I was saying this to my friend the other day that the Conservatives, especially, they usually have a gift of not collapsing, and when they're in trouble they manage to put differences aside and coalesce and regain their power, if that makes sense. But what seems to be happening here is that, and we've seen that with Labour, I think, in Scotland as well, is that they're beginning to shoot themselves in the foot a lot more. They're beginning to not understand what to do. I always think that when established power is challenged, I genuinely think that they don't know how to cope with that, because as an institution and as a power structure, they're used to getting what they want. That is probably maybe Scotland, one of Scotland's biggest strengths is that we will challenge, and if we don't go on the defensive, if we set the terms of that debate, I think it will send that structure into more crisis. They'll not know what to do, because what they tend to do is they fall back on the same patterns, but those patterns aren't working. And this is what I think what's probably most important is that what Westminster wants, what Westminster or what England even has voted for recently, is the exact opposite of what we want. I mean, Leslie Riddick talked about this on debate night. I think it was last week or the week before. She says for the last 100 years, Scotland has voted for social democratic parties, the Labour Party and the SNP. This is what we voted for. We voted for that social contract and the retainment of that social contract that you mentioned. But the path that England seems to be content in doing is very different. And Westminster's pushing that path very, very much in an opposite direction. I think they'll struggle with that. There's so much entitlement into that kind of core of Westminster government at that moment in time that I'm not sure they'll be used to being challenged at this level.
That's a very good point, Siobhan. Thank you. And we're not going to labour on, that's the wrong word, we're not going to focus on other politicians too much this evening. However, we were talking there about the Prime Minister. Now, I would always argue that his only way of operating is that it's now is not the time. He fails to make decisions, fails to lead, fails to manage until it gets to a point, as it always does with him, that it's now too late for him to affect the outcome, and effectively the decision is made for him. Now, I appreciate that you were talking about the Tories coalescing. This may be a hypothetical question with regard to Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, because his time in office may now be measured in months rather than or weeks rather than years. But do you think that those two things suggest that, in a way, voters in Scotland should put whatever it is that the Prime Minister says to one side, because in his time in office, he's not shown leadership, he's not shown management skills. He always waits until a decision is forced upon him. And so, in the circumstances, would it be your argument that the Scottish voters and Scots should just press on and get on with it and ignore what Boris Johnson says?
I'm not necessarily sure they should. I think they do. I think that if you think, you think of the reaction to what's happened recently with Boris Johnson. It's every week's a scandal, isn't it? And we kind of recognised that. We recognised that back in 2019. I think most people in Scotland, I think, saw Boris Johnson for what he was, and probably recognised quite clearly that this was going to be absolutely disastrous. Probably, to be fair, it's probably more disastrous than even I thought at the time. So I think there is an element that people in Scotland don't listen to him anyway. There will obviously be some, of course there were, and that's fair enough. But I think as a cultural whole, I don't think people necessarily listen to what he says. I think people don't believe him. So he can tell you black as white. He can tell you that it's raining outside, and it is raining, but you probably not believe him. You'd have to, you would just have to go out and double check. And I do think that, again, that's another element that that's probably set us on completely different paths, is that we don't trust a government that the rest of the UK, or to be fair, England seems to kind of put a lot of trust in, although that's crumbling as we speak on a daily basis.
Of course. Thank you, Siobhan. Now, we'll do one more little point of the legal thing and then move on. It's maybe worthwhile pointing out that the Supreme Court did make a statement this afternoon. It said that a reference was received. It was received a reference by the Lord Advocate under paragraph 34 of Schedule 6 to the Scotland Act 1998 under the Supreme Court's devolution jurisdiction. Under devolution legislation enacted by the UK Parliament, the Supreme Court may decide devolution issues such as whether the devolved executive and legislative authorities in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have acted or proposed to act within their powers. Devolution cases can reach the Supreme Court through a reference from someone who can exercise relevant statutory power, such as, in this instance, the Lord Advocate. This reference does not need to be granted permission by the court to proceed. The first step is for the reference to be referred to the President of the Supreme Court, who's a Scottish judge at the moment, the Right Honourable the Lord Reid of Allermuir, and he will make directions. He'll decide if there are preliminary matters to be addressed and when the case will be heard, how many justices will consider the reference, and who will sit on the bench. At this point, the court cannot confirm when the case will be heard. So that's the nuts and bolts of what the Supreme Court said this afternoon. My question for you, because the First Minister has put the legal process front and centre today, my question, Siobhan, is: Are folks going to become too scunnered with too much lawyering? As one thing, and at the same time, is there a risk that with the current Supreme Court, I get the impression this Supreme Court now is rather more circumspect about taking on Westminster politicians in comparison to the court was a few years ago. So either or both parts of that question, Siobhan, are folks going to get scunnered with hearing too many lawyers, and are we going to have a problem with this Supreme Court?
I was thinking the opposite. I thought never has a court case been so exciting, you know. But yes, I think that ultimately, yes, it might be seen as a breath of fresh air than over politicians fighting it out, I suppose. But I think ultimately, the ordinary person on the street will probably not pay much heed until the decision has been made. It is a risk, though. I think, and Nicola Sturgeon recognised that herself. I think Nicola Sturgeon is much more risk averse than Alex Salmond was in 2012, and there is an element, I think, that if there's a confidence there, then that confidence has probably got weight behind it in that respect. But it is a risk. Of course, it's a risk, but of course, what comes after that, if it decides that it's out with our competence, if the Supreme Court decides that question is out with our competence, then the path is, of course, to kind of take it further forward in terms of the democratic process. I don't know how long this process is going to be taking. When you were talking about that, I was thinking, is this going to be months? Is this going to be a year? How long will it be? I mean, Nicola Sturgeon seemed relatively confident that the decision would be made in time for the 19th of October 2023. So that's 15 and a half months or so. But how long this process takes, it'll be a nail-biting few months, or how long it takes. I don't know enough about the law to know how long that would take. But yeah, of course it's risky. Always, but the path to independence was always going to be a risk, but it's a risk that we now have to take.
Yep.
You have to take that risk. The bigger risk in doing nothing at this stage is, I think, much more riskier.
Absolutely, Siobhan. The court has got 478 days to get its act together, I think, is what we're saying. But let's look at two more aspects quite quickly, because time, as usual, is against us. Firstly, Conor Matchett in the Scotsman this afternoon was tweeting, this is a huge strategic gamble. The speech defines the First Minister's legacy based on what happens now and whether a vote happens. If not, it provides the next general election campaign for the SNP. The opposition are on the back foot and the Scottish Government is on the offensive in the courts. This is the First Minister's best move on independence during her tenure. Now, Conor Matchett, Scotsmen are not usually supporters of the Scottish Government or the SNP. Do you think his assessment today that this was the First Minister's best move during her tenure, do you think he's right?
I think so. I think that, I mean, there's I think we all knew that there was lots of discussions, there was lots of thinking, lots of kind of legal explorations, political explorations that were happening behind the scenes. I'm someone that's very impressed by Nicola Sturgeon, and actually very impressed by how the Scottish Government and the Parliament is actually working. But that kind of blew my mind the day. I thought that is pretty good. It really has. The offensive is exactly that. And let's see how it goes. But sorry, I can't remember the Scotsman guy's name. But he's right. Her legacy does rest on this. And but I do think we did reach a point that Scotland will forgive someone that tried. They're probably less likely to forgive someone who didn't bother trying. And I think that is the point we reached, or we were beginning to reach anyway. So I think there was a recognition in that. It's a gamble, of course it is. Yeah.
Of course. Now, Siobhan, we'll broaden out the geographical perspective here just for a moment. And I'm not doing the lawyering thing here, but I did read the bill very quickly this afternoon. It's not a long bill, and I'm talking about the independence referendum bill that the First Minister was talking about today. One thing that jumped off the page at me was that the bill now the bill refers to what are now called qualifying foreign nationals. These are people who you and I would call citizens of the EU. But they are expressly now include the laws the bill proposes to change the law to expressly include these people back into the franchise under Section 3 of the
Absolutely.
bill. How big an impact do you think that's going to have?
Well, if you want to think about it in terms of the referendum, probably will have a big impact. But in terms of democracy, it has a huge impact. I think that, and that principle has never actually changed since the last referendum, isn't it? If you live here, you vote here. And so I think that there is an element there that we have to encourage that. What I saw when I was canvassing is that, especially in the West End, where there was quite a bit of an international population there, was this kind of sense that, well, it's not my country, so therefore I'm not necessarily sure I should make a choice in the referendum. And we had a lot of discussions about, no, you live here, you vote here, you have the right to say how the future lies. And I think that that's work that probably needs done from an independence campaign perspective, is that everyone has the right to decide their future if they live here. So yes, I think that it's massively important. We know that we want Europe. We know that. Again, we voted for that again and again and again. And I think that Nicola Sturgeon very aptly said that today, that we are now the only path to get back into Europe. So what we need to do is start engaging on that level. In Dundee, we're lucky enough to have Heather Anderson now as one of our local councillors, who was obviously an ex-MEP, and she is now the Europe spokesperson for Dundee SNP in the council. So we can kind of hopefully, in a local level, build a very, very good campaign, including people. Not talking at them, but including them in part of the process. And actually, this comes back to, again, in terms of we talk realistically about how we can kind of resolve some of the kind of issues, how we would resolve the issue of the kind of cost of living crisis and the energy crisis. So well, how do we start incorporating all our international population into the democratic processes of Scotland? Because that's what we want. We want a diverse Scotland. That's what we're fighting for as well. We're fighting for that equality. So part of that campaign is going to be really important. It's about being respectful to everyone that lives here.
Respect for everyone who lives here. That's a fantastic note to end on, Siobhan. Thank you, because that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes for you. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. You will find our appeals for assistance on Facebook and Twitter, because the urgent need for financial support has not gone away. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you will also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. And when you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Meantime, I will be here again tomorrow evening with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you to everyone who's been watching this evening, and a very special thanks to our very special guest, Councillor Dr. Siobhan Tolland. Thanks, Siobhan.
Okay, thanks.
As it's the anniversary today of the date in 1746 when Flora MacDonald helped Bronnie Prince Charlie escape from Benbecula and leave Scotland for France, never to return, I'm away to battle our foes who stand by the shore, because follow they will not dare. I hope that you can join us again here on Broadcasting Scotland very soon. Bye-bye.